Rome, late September 1986. A man stands motionless in the dark of a small rented apartment, listening to footsteps fading in the stairwell outside his door. His name is Mordechai Vanunu, and somewhere out there in the city are people who want him, not because of what he carries, but because of what he already revealed. The most dangerous thing he possesses is no longer in his suitcase or his pockets. It is in the vault of a London newspaper, and in the memories of the editors who have seen what he smuggled out of the desert. Yet it is his body they need to erase. His voice they must silence. A few streets away, in a quiet hotel room, a woman with honey blonde hair snaps her suitcase shut and checks her passport with practiced calm. To hotel staff, she is Cindy, an American tourist enjoying Europe. To the intelligence handlers watching this operation unfold, she is Cheryl Bentov, a Mossad operative who has just completed the most delicate phase of her mission. Within hours, Rome will stop being a romantic backdrop and turn into the city where a man disappears without a trace. If you want to follow more gripping stories about Mossad and the hidden world of intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next investigations. The story of how Mordechai ended up in that Roman apartment begins years earlier, under the blinding sun and dust of Israel's southern desert, far from any tourist map. In the Negev, a complex of low, functional buildings rose out of the sand, wrapped in fences, guards, and euphemisms. Officially, it was a textile plant. Unofficially, for those inside Israel's security establishment, it had only one real name: Dimona, the heart of the country's nuclear project. Above ground, everything looked almost ordinary. Below ground, hidden behind blast doors and layers of concrete, stretched a secret industrial world. Reactor halls, processing lines, storage vaults, laboratories that never appeared on any public blueprint. People who worked there signed lifetime secrecy commitments, knowing that careless words could cost them their freedom. Mordechai Vanunu arrived there in 1976, a 22-year-old technician with few illusions but many needs. He had been born in Morocco and brought to Israel as a child, growing up in Beersheba on the social margins of a young, tense country. He completed his compulsory military service, learned technical skills, and went looking for a stable job that paid better than casual work and carried some prestige. Dimona offered exactly that: secure employment, higher wages, and the feeling of being part of something important, even if no one was allowed to say what that something was. At first, he accepted the secrecy as part of the deal. He descended every day into the underground levels, checked machinery, monitored routine processes, and followed instructions. The walls were thick, the corridors windowless, time marked by shifts and alarms rather than sunlight. Over the years, however, familiarity brought unease instead of comfort. The more he saw, the more obvious it became that the textile plant cover story was a fiction no one even tried to make convincing. Equipment designed for plutonium production, storage arrangements suited for nuclear cores, procedures centered on materials that never left the site as fabric or consumer goods. All of it pointed to one conclusion: Israel was not just experimenting, it was building. In the early 1980s, Mordechai's political views began to shift as well. He drifted toward left-wing student groups and activists, listened to arguments about occupation, militarism, and nuclear escalation, and gradually stopped treating secrecy as sacred. He started asking questions, not in the control room, but in conversations outside work that security officers eventually heard about. In an environment where loyalty was measured in silence, his doubts made him stand out. By 1985, after nearly a decade in the facility, Dimona's security staff decided he was no longer simply a worker with opinions. He was a potential risk. The dismissal itself looked routine on paper: contract termination, internal reorganization, vague language about incompatibility with security standards. For Mordechai, it felt like a door slamming shut without explanation. Yet by the time his access badge stopped working and his last shift ended, he had already crossed a more serious line. In his final months underground, he had managed to bring in a small camera in pieces, assembled it inside, and, over multiple shifts, taken a series of photographs in some of the most restricted areas. He chose angles that showed scale and layout: the reactor core, processing equipment, storage racks, corridors that only insiders usually saw. By the time he walked out for the last time, he carried several rolls of film that, if developed and authenticated, could prove that Israel had joined the nuclear club in far more than name. In January 1986, he left Israel altogether. His first destination was Australia, a country he had visited before and associated with distance, anonymity, and a kind of freedom that had always felt out of reach at home. In Sydney, he picked up casual jobs, drifted between neighborhoods, and tried to reinvent himself. He connected with Christian communities, began attending services, and eventually converted. The change in faith symbolized more than theology. It was also a deliberate break from the national and cultural frame that had shaped his life and his years at Dimona. But the film he had taken from the desert did not disappear with any baptism or new set of friends. It stayed with him in his belongings, a physical reminder that he carried knowledge no one outside a small circle of Israeli officials was supposed to have. Weeks turned into months, and he swung between extremes. On some days, he felt that he should burn the negatives, erase the temptation, and try to build a quiet life. On other days, he was consumed by the conviction that keeping silent made him complicit in a dangerous secret, that at least one major newspaper or international body should see what Israel was hiding. By mid-1986, the second impulse won. Mordechai searched for a journalist who would understand both the technical and political weight of what he had. That search led him, through contacts and inquiries, to the name Peter Hunam, an investigative reporter working for the Sunday Times in London. Hunam had already built a reputation for serious work on defense and nuclear issues. If anyone could get such a story taken seriously, and protect a source at least to some degree, it would be a team like his. Their first communications were cautious. From Australia, Mordechai called and hinted at his background: employment at a highly classified facility in Israel, access to sensitive areas, and photographic evidence that the country possessed a sophisticated nuclear weapons capability, while officially insisting it would not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons to the Middle East. He did not send the pictures by mail, nor did he give full technical detail over the phone, but he said enough for Hunam and his editors to realize that, if the claims were genuine, they faced one of the most consequential stories of the decade. There was only one way to confirm it. The newspaper invited him to London, offering to cover travel and accommodation while they assessed both the man and the material. It was not a decision Mordechai took lightly. Going to Britain meant leaving the relative obscurity of Sydney and stepping much closer to Israel's reach. Yet, he also understood that until qualified experts examined the photographs, his moral crisis would never resolve. He booked a ticket. In early September 1986, he landed at Heathrow with a modest suitcase and a secret that was no longer theoretical. The undeveloped or carefully hidden images of Dimona traveled with him, not as leverage for money or asylum, but as his proof that Israel's official ambiguity was a carefully maintained illusion. He checked into a small hotel and, almost at once, began a sequence of meetings at the Sunday Times offices. The first conversations were exploratory. Editors and lawyers asked about his past, his work at Dimona, his reasons for coming forward now. Then came the moment that shifted the story from possibility to reality. He produced the photographs. When they were developed, technical consultants, physicists, nuclear engineers, specialists in reactor design, went through them frame by frame. They recognized standard features of plutonium production, saw evidence of multiple underground levels and substantial throughput capacity, and concluded that these were not propaganda shots staged for an outsider. They were operational images taken by someone who knew where to stand and what to include in each frame. Gradually, a picture emerged that was larger than any single photograph. Israel, according to their estimates, had already produced enough fissile material for dozens, perhaps hundreds, of nuclear warheads. The country that never confirmed or denied its arsenal turned out to be, by volume, one of the more significant nuclear powers on the planet. Mordechai, meanwhile, remained in the background of his own story. He moved between his small hotel room and the newspaper offices, avoiding crowded public places and limiting contacts. The closer the editors came to a publication date, the more he felt the tightening senses of risk. He knew that once the story went to print, he would be marked forever as the man who had broken one of Israel's deepest taboos. What he did not yet know was that, even before any headline appeared, another set of eyes had already fixed on him. Not in Sydney, and not only at Heathrow, but now in London itself, where a different team had started to study his habits, his fears, and his weaknesses with a very different goal in mind. Below is the new Part 2, aligned with the fixed timeline and logic from Part 1. The relationship develops over about 2 weeks, then leads into the Rome trip, without contradicting dates or urgency. For several days in London, Mordechai moved like a shadow between his hotel and the Sunday Times building. But he was not the only one keeping a routine. A different group, working out of anonymous offices and rented flats, had marked him as a priority target. His name had been circulating inside Israeli intelligence long before he appeared in London. His departure from Israel, his time in Australia, his conversion to Christianity, his political statements, each of these had been logged, analyzed, and flagged as warning signs. When he finally surfaced in connection with a major British newspaper, the warning turned into an alarm. Within Israel's intelligence hierarchy, the conclusion was blunt. Allowing him to speak freely to one of the world's most respected newspapers about Dimona was unacceptable. Killing him would be simpler, but riskier. An unexplained death in London could blow back politically and expose networks that took years to build. A more elegant solution was needed, one that would remove him from British jurisdiction without a public scandal. He had to be persuaded, fooled, or lured into going somewhere else, somewhere quieter, where a disappearance would look less like an operation and more like a mystery. To make that happen, they turned to an officer who specialized in precisely these kinds of problems. Her operational identity for this mission would be Cindy, an American tourist spending a few carefree weeks in Europe. Her real name, known only inside the service and to a handful of colleagues, was Cheryl Bentov. She was in her early 30s, fluent in English with a natural American accent, and carried herself with the relaxed confidence of someone who had played this role before. Her task was not to tail a man in the dark or bug his hotel room. Her task was to walk into his life as if she belonged there. Before Cheryl set foot in London, analysts compiled a psychological profile of Mordechai, using everything they had collected over the years. He was intelligent but impulsive, politically engaged, emotionally isolated, and lately, uprooted. He had broken with his past, his country, and to a degree his family. He spent long hours alone, burdened by the knowledge of what he had done and what he was about to unleash. Such people, the profile suggested, were often hungry for something simple, companionship that did not revolve around secrets and politics, someone who appeared to see the human being rather than the source or traitor. Cheryl arrived in London in early September, a few days after Mordechai. She did not go straight to him. Instead, surveillance teams mapped his patterns, which streets he used, which cafes he preferred when he needed air, how often he left his hotel, how nervous he appeared in public. Only when they felt they understood his rhythms did she enter the picture. The first contact had to feel accidental, a moment both could later describe as pure coincidence. It happened in the late afternoon, near Leicester Square. Mordechai had just left another long meeting at the newspaper and needed to clear his head. He bought a coffee and found a small table outside a cafe, watching tourists drift past and listening to languages he did not understand. Across from him, at another table, a blonde woman leafed through a travel guide, occasionally glancing up at the crowd with a half-smile that looked more like curiosity than boredom. For a while, nothing happened. He sipped his drink, she turned pages. Then the wind shifted, lifting a folded map from her table and dropping it near his feet. He bent down, picked it up, and held it out. She looked up, met his eyes, and smiled. "Thank you," she said, in a soft American accent. "London wind is trying to steal my entire trip." Her tone was light, unthreatening. He smiled back, more out of politeness than intention, but she did not let the thread drop. "Do you live here?" she asked, nodding toward the street. "Or are you lost like me?" "I do not live here," he answered. His English was careful but clear. "I am visiting." "Same," she said. "I am Cindy, from Florida. First time in London." She gestured toward the empty chair at his table. "Do you mind? It is better to be lost with company." He hesitated, then nodded. She moved over, bringing her coffee and map with her, and just like that, they were no longer two strangers separated by a few tables, but a pair of travelers comparing notes on an unfamiliar city. They started with safe topics. She asked what he had seen so far, what surprised him about London, what he missed from home. He kept his answers vague, but found himself relaxing as the conversation drifted toward weather, crowds, and small cultural differences. She talked about beaches and humidity in Florida, about saving for this trip, about wanting to see as much of Europe as possible before going back to a routine life. She sprinkled small personal details, a job as a beautician, a friend who canceled at the last minute, a sister living in Rome, all designed to make her feel specific and real without giving anything away. Over the next 10 days, their paths crossed more than once. A quick greeting outside the same cafe, a shared table when the place was crowded, then a deliberate suggestion. Maybe they could meet on purpose instead of by accident. Mordechai, who had spent months surrounded by journalists and strangers who saw him primarily as a story, found her presence disarming. Cindy did not ask about his work, did not pry into what he did in London. When he mentioned he was under some stress, she did not dig for reasons. She simply said, "Everyone needs a break sometimes," and changed the subject. It did not take long for him to start looking forward to their meetings. They walked along the Thames one evening, the lights of the city flickering on the water, while she told stories about growing up in a small American town, about wanting to see old places with real history. They shared inexpensive dinners, laughed about getting lost in underground stations, and compared notes on the strange feeling of being foreigners in the same city. She listened more than she spoke, but when she did talk about herself, the details were vivid enough to feel genuine. Slowly, the barrier between casual acquaintance and something more intimate thinned. She would touch his arm lightly when she laughed, lean in when he spoke, look at him a fraction longer than necessary when their eyes met. He noticed, and he did not mind. The weight on his shoulders felt slightly less heavy in her company. Here was someone who did not see him as a nuclear technician, or a traitor, or a source. To Cindy, or so it seemed, he was just a man trying to figure out his life in a foreign city. During this period, the Sunday Times moved toward a tentative publication schedule. Lawyers argued about phrasing, editors debated headlines, technical consultants refined their estimates of Israel's nuclear capacity. They penciled in a likely Sunday in early October for the piece to run, knowing they could still pull back if something major changed. Mordechai knew the rough time frame, and the knowledge pressed on him like an approaching storm. Once the article appeared, nothing in his life would ever be quiet again. That was when Cindy began, very gently, to introduce Rome. One evening, after a day when London's sky had stayed stubbornly gray and the wind cut through their coats, they sat in a small Italian restaurant near Soho. She pushed aside her plate and sighed theatrically. "You know what I miss?" she said. "Sun, and food that tastes like it belongs under that sun. My sister lives in Rome. Every time she sends me photos, I want to jump on a plane." "You have a sister in Rome?" he asked. "Yes," Cindy said, swirling the last of her wine. "She works there. Small place, nothing fancy, but her apartment has this amazing view. She keeps telling me, 'Come before you go back home, do not waste the chance.'" She looked at him, as if weighing whether to say the next part. "I was thinking, maybe I should listen to her. Just a few days, a short trip. London is wonderful, but Rome is..." She searched for the word. "Alive." He listened, saying nothing at first. Rome, for him, was just another city he had never seen, somewhere on a map between his past and an uncertain future. "You should go," he said finally, "if you want it so much." Her smile was quick and warm, but she shook her head. "Alone? It is not the same. You sit in a beautiful place, you want to turn and say, 'Look at that,' and there is no one next to you. I did not expect to meet anyone here I would actually enjoy traveling with." She held his gaze just long enough to make the implication clear, especially someone who looks like he could use a few days where he is not thinking so much. The suggestion hung between them. Part of him reacted instantly with caution. The newspaper had warned him to stay close, to remain visible, to keep them informed of his movements. He knew he was taking a risk every time he stepped outside alone. But another part of him, the part that was tired of interviews, of closed rooms, of being treated as a fragile piece of evidence, felt a sharp, almost painful longing for exactly what she described. A brief escape before everything collapsed into hearings, headlines, and consequences. "I cannot be away long," he said slowly. "There is work here that will not wait." "Of course," she replied. "I would not ask you to disappear. 2 or 3 days at most. Fly on a Friday, back by Monday. A little pocket of time before your life gets complicated." She did not ask him what complicated meant. She did not press for details of his work. The restraint only deepened his sense that she cared more about him than about whatever story he was part of. Over the next few days, she did not mention Rome every time they met. She let the idea rest, then returned to it lightly. as if it were just a thought she had not fully let go of. "My sister says end of September is perfect," she said one afternoon. "Not too hot, still bright. She can leave keys for us with a neighbor if she is not there. We would not even have to stay in a hotel. No one would bother us." "No one would know we are there," he replied, half joking, half testing. "Exactly," she said with a playful smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "A secret getaway. London will survive without us for a weekend." He told himself he was still deciding, that he had not actually agreed to anything. He told himself he would clear it with the newspaper, or at least leave a clear message before he left. In reality, the decision had already begun to take shape the moment she said the words, "before your life gets complicated." Because he believed her, or wanted to, when she implied that this small detour could be the last quiet moment before the world knew his name. When he finally said yes, it happened almost casually. They were walking near the river, the sky for once, a clear, pale blue over London. "Maybe your sister is right," he said. "Maybe it is not wise to waste the chance." Cindy looked at him, as if making sure she had heard correctly. "Are you saying you will come?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "if it is only a few days." Her response was quick, controlled, but he could see something like relief and triumph behind the composure. "Then I will book the tickets," she said. "End of the month. We will be back before your work needs you." He nodded, and in that small movement he crossed a line he could no longer see. The date they chose fell neatly before the tentative publication Sunday. To him, it looked like a narrow window for a harmless escape. To the people watching from a distance, it looked like exactly what they had been waiting for. A moment when the man they needed to remove from London would leave British soil of his own free will, in the company of a woman no one would suspect. As he walked back to his hotel later that day, he did feel a twinge of unease. The editors had told him to be cautious. He knew how much anger his revelations could provoke in the people he had once worked for. But then he thought of those long, gray days in the newspaper office, the endless questions, the legal debates, the diagrams of reactors and warheads. He compared them to the image Cindy had painted of stepping out into Roman sunlight, just for a weekend, with someone who saw him as more than a source. For a man already standing on the edge of a decision that would define the rest of his life, that promise was enough to quiet the warning voice inside his head. The flight from London to Rome was short, less than 3 hours, but for Mordechai, it felt like a crossing into a different world. As the plane began its descent, the gray smear of British skies in his memory was replaced by bright Italian light and a patchwork of ochre roofs. Cindy sat by the window, pointing out the coastline, the clustered buildings, the shimmer of the Mediterranean. "See," she said, "already better than London rain." He forced a smile, trying to quiet the nervous flutter in his stomach. Part of it was the normal anxiety of travel. Another part came from a quieter, more rational place, asking the same question over and over. Was this wise? They landed in the late afternoon. At the airport, Cindy moved with the ease of someone used to traveling alone. Passport ready, small luggage, no fuss. Mordechai followed her through the terminal, reminding himself that they were just two tourists. No one here knew his face. No one cared about a technician from an Israeli desert who had talked to a London newspaper. They took a taxi into the city. Rome unfolded outside the car windows as a dense maze of history and traffic. Domes and bell towers, stone facades, laundry hanging from balconies, scooters weaving through impossible gaps. For a brief moment, the sheer sensory overload dulled his sense of risk. Whatever else might be waiting, this place was undeniably alive. Cindy had arranged a small hotel near the center, not far from narrow streets full of cafes and shops. At the reception, she handled the conversation, signing the forms with an easy, practiced signature as Cindy Meyer, United States. Mordechai signed under his real name. The clerk barely glanced at him, then handed over a key. In the room, with its modest furniture and view of a nearby courtyard, Cindy dropped her bag and turned to him with a smile. "Welcome to Rome," she said. "First rule, no stress allowed." He laughed, but the tension in his shoulders did not entirely leave. Still, the first evening passed without incident. They walked to a nearby trattoria, ate simple pasta, and drank house wine, while listening to the musical rise and fall of Italian conversations around them. Cindy pointed out couples at neighboring tables, invented little stories about them, joked about how easily one could get lost in these streets. For that night at least, the the city kept its promise of being a temporary refuge from the London vortex. They returned to the hotel late and fell asleep to the faint hum of traffic and distant voices. The next morning, Cindy woke early, leaning on the windowsill to look down into the courtyard, where a few residents were hanging laundry in the clear light. "My sister is going to hate me," she said, half joking. "I am in her city without telling her yet." "I thought she knew we were coming," he said. "She knows I might come," Cindy replied, turning toward him. "Not that I decided, but I have an idea." She sat on the edge of the bed. "She has this apartment," Cindy continued. "Small, but the view is incredible. She is away right now, but she told me if I ever came when she was gone, she could leave the keys with a neighbor. We would have more privacy there than in a hotel. No tourists going in and out. No staff listening to us come and go." Mordechai considered that. Privacy sounded good. He had spent the last weeks constantly watched in one form or another, even by people who wanted to help him. A quiet, private space where he could simply exist sounded dangerously appealing. "Do you trust this neighbor?" he asked. Cindy gave a small laugh. "She has been living there for years. It is not a spy movie. It is just a building with people who know each other. I can call my sister now, ask her to arrange it. We go there later today, enjoy the view, pretend we live normal lives for a minute." The choice felt almost trivial compared to the decisions he had already made in recent months. He nodded. "Call her," he said. "If it is easy, we can go." Cindy picked up the phone on the small desk, dialed a number from memory, and turned away as she spoke quickly in a mix of English and the kind of relaxed familiarity that comes from close family ties. Mordechai could not hear every word, but the tone was casual, light. After a few minutes, she hung up and turned back to him. "She will leave the keys," Cindy said. "We can go this afternoon." They spent the late morning walking through parts of the city tourists came to see. A crowded square with an ancient fountain, narrow streets where sunlight fell in sharp angles between buildings, churches that smelled of incense and old stone. Cindy pointed out details with the curiosity of someone who had read about these places long before seeing them. She held his hand as they moved through crowds, and for a while he let himself believe that this was all it was, a brief, stolen holiday before the rest of his life arrived. But as the day wore on and they left the busy central district for quieter neighborhoods, a thin thread of unease returned. The streets grew narrower, the buildings more residential. Children played soccer in a courtyard. Elderly women watched from windows. Cindy walked with confidence, as if she knew exactly where she was going. "Almost there," she said. "You are going to love this view." They reached a nondescript building on a side street, its entrance unremarkable among others on the block. Cindy rang a bell, waited, then smiled as someone buzzed them in. Inside, the stairwell smelled of stone and cleaning solution. She led the way up several flights, the sound of their footsteps echoing. At the top floor, she stopped before a plain door. "The neighbor left the keys under the mat," she said lightly, bending down. Her hand disappeared briefly, then came up with a small ring of keys. Somewhere under his accumulated layers of fatigue and denial, a sharper instinct stirred. He did not know what exactly felt wrong. The too smooth transition from hotel to apartment, the effortless access, the slightly too practiced movements, but a reflex honed over years of living under security rules flickered to life. "Are you sure this is—" He did not finish the sentence. Cindy had already unlocked the door and pushed it open, stepping inside with a gesture for him to follow. The apartment was dim, curtains drawn against the afternoon light. The air had that slightly stale stillness of a place unoccupied for a few days. There were no obvious personal touches in the small entryway, a plain table, a coat rack, a closed door to the left. "Come," Cindy said. "The living room is this way. You will see the balcony." He stepped over the threshold. For a second, nothing moved. Then, from the shadows of the next room, men emerged with the precise coordination of people who had rehearsed the same sequence over and over. One grabbed his right arm, another his left, twisting them behind his back before he could react. A third moved in front of him, blocking the exit. The door they had just entered swung shut with a heavy finality. Mordechai shouted, instinctively switching into Hebrew, then English, demanding to know what was happening. His heart hammered. His body snapped from tourist mode into raw survival. He tried to pull free, but the hold on his arms tightened, pain shooting down his shoulders. "Do not struggle," one of the men said in Hebrew, his voice low and controlled. "It will be worse for you if you do." The sudden switch to his own language cut through the confusion like a knife. In that instant, scattered fears and suspicions crystallized into one awful clarity. These were not random criminals or local police. These were his own people, or rather, the people he had betrayed. He twisted his head, searching for Cindy. She stood a few steps away, near the door, her back no longer relaxed but straight, her expression stripped of warmth. The soft traveler's smile was gone. In its place was a calm, unreadable face that showed neither joy nor regret, only completion. "Cindy," he gasped. "What are you doing? What is this?" For a heartbeat, she met his eyes. If there was any trace of the woman he thought he knew, it was buried deep. "You should not have done what you did," she said quietly, still in English. "This is the consequence." One of the men produced a syringe from a small case, flicking it with practiced efficiency to remove air bubbles. Mordechai thrashed once more, a desperate attempt to break free, but the grip on him was iron. The needle bit into his arm. A cold rush spread through his veins. The room began to tilt. Voices blurred and stretched. His last clear image was of Cindy, or whatever her name truly was, standing perfectly still by the closed door, watching as his knees buckled and the men holding him eased his collapsing weight to the floor. When he returned to consciousness, the world had shrunk to a small, metal-walled space with no windows and a ceiling too low for comfort. The faint vibration under his body, the rhythmic sway, all of it registered before the rest of his mind fully reassembled. He was lying on a narrow bunk. His wrists and ankles were secured with padded restraints. For a few seconds, he clung to the hope that this was some temporary facility in Rome, that authorities might be involved, that there would be some due process. Then, a different kind of awareness slid into place, the low hum of engines, the slightly different cadence of movement. He was at sea. A door opened with a thick mechanical sound. Two men entered, both in plain clothes, their faces expressionless. One carried a clipboard, the other stood near the door with his hands loosely at his sides, relaxed, but ready. "You are awake," the man with the clipboard said in Hebrew. "Good." "Where am I?" Mordechai asked, his voice raw. "What is this?" "You are on an Israeli vessel," the man replied. "We are in international waters. You are being returned to Israel to face trial for serious offenses against state security." The words fell with the weight of something long decided, not up for debate. "You cannot do this," Mordechai said. "I was in Rome. This is kidnapping. You have no right. You have no standing to lecture anyone about rights," the man interrupted, his tone still even. "You stole classified information. You attempted to expose the most sensitive secrets of the state to foreign media. You knew the consequences." Mordechai pulled against the restraints, feeling the straps cut into his skin. "Where is she?" he demanded. "Cindy, where is she?" The slightest flicker of something, annoyance, amusement, fatigue, crossed the face of the man with the clipboard. "That is not a name you need to worry about anymore," he said. "You should focus on your own situation. We can make this trip easier or harder for you, depending on how you behave. Either way, you will arrive in Israel. That part will not change." The other man stepped forward, checked the restraints, then adjusted a monitoring device near the bed. "You will be given food and water," he said. "You will be allowed to use the toilet under supervision. If you become too agitated, you will be sedated again. Do you understand?" It was not a question in any meaningful sense. Still, Mordechai nodded once, more out of instinct than agreement. When they left and the door closed again, the room seemed even smaller. He stared at the ceiling, feeling every slight motion of the ship, every vibration of the engines. Somewhere above him were open decks, sky, salt air. Somewhere behind him lay Rome, the city he had entered as a free man and left as a bound package. The hours blurred. Sometimes he slept from sheer exhaustion, sometimes from sedatives administered by a doctor who appeared briefly, checked his pulse and pupils, and disappeared again. The food was functional and tasteless. Conversation, when it happened at all, stayed strictly within the bounds of necessity. No one answered questions about where they had picked him up, what story they would tell the outside world, or who had signed off on this operation. Alone with his thoughts, he replayed every decision that had brought him here. leaving Israel, keeping the photographs instead of destroying them, contacting the Sunday Times, flying to London, saying yes to a woman in a cafe who smiled at him like he was not a problem to be solved. Each step had felt, in the moment, like the only way forward. Now they lined up in his mind like links in a chain, pulling him steadily toward the same point. The ship's journey lasted several days. When it finally docked, it did so quietly, far from any public terminal. Early in the morning, still half sedated, he was moved from the metal room to a waiting vehicle with blacked-out windows. The restraints were removed from his ankles but kept on his wrists. No one spoke during the transfer. By the time the vehicle stopped and he was led out into a high-walled, anonymous facility, there was no doubt left about where he had arrived. The air, the light, the language spoken in clipped instructions around him, all of it belonged to the country he had once served and then defied. Word of his return would not reach the public for some time. Officially, the story would never include Rome, or a blonde American tourist, or a rented apartment with the curtains drawn. Those details would remain buried under layers of secrecy and denial. But for Mordechai, strapped to a metal chair in an interrogation room, the operation had already achieved its purpose. Whatever the Sunday Times chose to print, whatever the world eventually learned about Dimona, he himself had been brought back into the grip of the state he had tried to expose. The interrogation room had no windows, no clocks, and no softness. A metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, a single bright light overhead that never dimmed. Mordechai sat on one side, his wrists still bearing faint marks from the restraints used during transport. Across from him sat men who rotated in shifts, their questions sharp and repetitive, designed not just to extract information, but to wear down whatever remained of his resistance. They wanted names. They wanted to know if he had contacted foreign intelligence services before approaching the newspaper. They wanted lists of everyone at Dimona who might have helped him, knowingly or otherwise. They wanted details about his time in Australia, his conversion, his political contacts, his meetings in London. Most of all, they wanted him to admit that what he had done was not conscience but treason, not whistleblowing but espionage. Mordechai gave them the same answers over and over. He had acted alone. No one at Dimona had known about the photographs. No foreign government had recruited him. He had gone to the Sunday Times because he believed the world deserved transparency about nuclear weapons, not because he wanted to harm Israel. His interrogators did not believe him. Or perhaps they did, and that made it worse. A naive idealist was harder to categorize than a paid spy, harder to fit into the clean narratives that justified operations like the one that had brought him back from Rome. Days bled into one another. Sleep came in brief, interrupted stretches. Meals arrived on trays without explanation of what time of day it was. The isolation was deliberate, designed to make him lose any sense of continuity or control. Sometimes the questions stopped, and he was left alone for hours, the silence as oppressive as the interrogations themselves. In one of those long silences, a different officer entered, older, quieter, less interested in shouting. He placed a folder on the table and opened it carefully. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. Mordechai looked down. Inside the folder were newspaper clippings. The first one was a full front page from the Sunday Times, dated early October. The headline read, "Revealed: The Secrets of Israel's Nuclear Arsenal." Below it, one of his photographs from Dimona, grainy but unmistakable. "They published," the officer said. "Without you. Your story is out there. Governments are reacting. Diplomats are scrambling. You got what you wanted." He closed the folder. "Was it worth this?" he asked, gesturing around the room. Mordechai did not answer. He had no answer that would satisfy the man across from him, and he was no longer sure he had one that satisfied himself. While Mordechai sat in that windowless room, the world outside had indeed moved. The Sunday Times article detonated across international media. Other newspapers picked it up, translating sections, running their own analysis. Photographs of the Dimona reactor appeared on front pages from Washington to Tokyo. Nuclear experts were interviewed on television, walking viewers through what the images revealed about plutonium production and weapons capability. Israel's policy of deliberate ambiguity, maintained for decades, was suddenly under a spotlight it had never faced before. Governments that had long suspected Israel's nuclear status now had confirmation in the form of insider testimony and technical documentation. diplomatic channels filled with pointed questions. The International Atomic Energy Agency issued statements. Editorials debated whether Israel's secrecy had been justified or reckless, whether Mordechai was a hero or a traitor. Israeli officials responded with a mix of silence and misdirection. They refused to confirm or deny the specifics, maintaining the traditional formula. Israel would not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons to the Middle East. Privately, within intelligence and political circles, fury raged. The breach was unprecedented. Entire security protocols were being rewritten to prevent another Vanunu. In early November, the Israeli government made a terse public announcement. Mordechai Vanunu had been apprehended and was in Israeli custody. The statement gave no details about how or where the arrest had occurred. It did not mention Rome or a ship or an elaborate intelligence operation. The official line was that he had voluntarily returned to face justice. International legal experts immediately raised doubts. Italy launched inquiries, suspecting a violation of its sovereignty. Britain, where Mordechai had been living under journalistic protection, demanded explanations. Israel stonewalled, offering nothing beyond vague reassurances that all actions had been lawful. Inside Mossad, the operation was celebrated as a textbook success. A high-value target had been removed from a hostile environment without violence, without diplomatic fallout, and with surgical precision. Cheryl Bentov, the operative who had played the role of Cindy, received quiet commendations. Her identity remained classified, her face unknown to the public. For years, she moved through other assignments, her role in the Vanunu case buried in files accessible only to a handful of people. Eventually, investigative journalists pieced together enough fragments, witness accounts, surveillance footage, interviews with former colleagues, to identify her. When her name and photograph appeared in print, accompanied by detailed reconstructions of the Rome operation, she gave a single interview. She expressed no regrets. She had done her job. Mordechai had stolen state secrets and endangered Israeli security. Stopping him required deception, but deception was standard tradecraft. She had served her country, protected its most sensitive program, and helped neutralize a serious threat. Whether he had been motivated by conscience or naivety did not change the outcome he deserved. The contrast between their post-Rome lives could not have been starker. Mordechai's trial began in mid-1987, held entirely behind closed doors to prevent further leaks of classified material. He was charged with treason, espionage, and unauthorized disclosure of state secrets. The prosecution presented the photographs, transcripts of his interviews with the Sunday Times, and testimony from Dimona officials about the damage his revelations had caused. His defense argued that he was a whistleblower acting on moral conviction, that he had exposed a program with global implications, and that transparency served the public interest. The judges were unmoved. In early 1988, they convicted him on all charges and sentenced him to 18 years in prison. But the sentence came with an additional punishment that would prove far more devastating than the years themselves. Mordechai was placed in solitary confinement. Prison officials justified the measure by claiming he still possessed classified information that could endanger national security if shared with other inmates. In practice, the isolation served multiple purposes. It prevented him from becoming a rallying figure within the prison. It inflicted psychological damage as a form of extended punishment, and it sent a chilling message to anyone else contemplating similar disclosures. Solitary confinement meant 23 hours a day in a cell roughly 2 meters by 3. 1 hour of exercise in a caged outdoor space. No contact with other prisoners. Visits from family were rare, brief, and heavily monitored. No communal meals, no religious services, no programs. Just the walls, the ceiling, the narrow bed, and the silence. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Mordechai developed routines to preserve his sanity. He exercised in the confined space, doing push-ups and stretches to keep his body functional. He read whatever books were approved, often finishing one and immediately starting another to avoid the gap of emptiness between them. He studied languages from textbooks, worked through mathematical problems, wrote letters that were censored before being sent. Some days he felt strong, convinced that history would vindicate him. Other days brought despair so deep that simply staying alive felt like an act of stubborn defiance rather than hope. International human rights organizations began campaigning for his release. Amnesty International declared him a prisoner of conscience. Nobel laureates, including Desmond Tutu and Mayreed Maguire, called publicly for an end to his isolation. Psychiatric experts who examined him during rare authorized visits documented symptoms consistent with torture: severe depression, anxiety, difficulty with memory and concentration, emotional numbness. The Israeli government remained unmoved. Mordechai, they insisted, still posed a security risk. The information in his head, though decades old, was still classified. The isolation would continue. In 2004, after serving the full 18 years, he was released from prison. But the release was conditional and restrictive. He was forbidden from leaving Israel, from speaking to foreigners without prior approval, from approaching embassies or borders. He had to report regularly to security services. His movements were monitored, his phone calls recorded. He settled in a small apartment in Jerusalem, trying to rebuild something resembling a normal life. Supporters continued to advocate for his right to emigrate, particularly to Norway, which had granted him citizenship in absentia. Israeli courts denied every petition. Allowing him to leave, they argued, would still endanger national security. In 2010, he was arrested again, this time for violating the terms of his release by meeting with foreign journalists. He spent additional months in detention before being released under even stricter conditions. The years of confinement and stress destroyed his health. He developed thyroid cancer, which some attributed to radiation exposure during his years at Dimona. He aged rapidly, his face lined and worn far beyond his years. Yet through it all, he never recanted. In carefully monitored interviews, he maintained that he had done the right thing, that exposing Israel's nuclear program had been a moral imperative. He expressed sorrow for the personal cost, but no regret for the act itself. The debate over his legacy remained unresolved. To Israeli security officials and many citizens, he was a traitor who had damaged the country's most vital defense secret for the sake of naive idealism. To nuclear disarmament advocates and human rights activists, he was a courageous whistleblower who had sacrificed everything to bring transparency to one of the world's most dangerous arsenals. The question of whether his sacrifice achieved anything tangible was harder to answer. Israel's nuclear program, once exposed, continued without significant international interference. The photographs shocked the world briefly, but led to no sanctions, no inspections, no fundamental change in policy. Strategic ambiguity returned as the default Israeli posture. In practical terms, Mordechai's revelations embarrassed the government but did not disarm it. Still, his story became a reference point in debates about whistleblowing, state secrecy, and the moral responsibilities of individuals who possess dangerous knowledge. His case was studied in intelligence training programs, ethics seminars, and law schools. He became a symbol, though whether of courage or foolishness depended entirely on who was telling the story. In 2021, after more than 3 decades of legal battles and international pressure, Israeli authorities finally allowed him to leave the country. He flew first to Istanbul, then to France, where he settled quietly. The decision came without explanation or fanfare. Some believed that his outdated knowledge of 1980s nuclear technology no longer justified his continued restriction. Others suspected that years of international embarrassment had finally outweighed security concerns. By the time he stepped off the plane in Paris, he was a free man in name, though the years of isolation and confinement had left scars that would never heal. He had survived, outlasted his captors, and finally achieved the freedom to live without surveillance. But the cost had been almost everything: his youth, his health, decades of his life. The woman who had led him into that Roman apartment lived a very different life. Cheryl Bentov had returned to normal intelligence work, moved through promotions and assignments, and eventually retired with honors. When her identity was revealed years later, she faced no legal consequences. She had acted under orders, in service of her country, using skills she had been trained to deploy. The moral calculus of their story remained ambiguous. Was Mordechai a hero who exposed a dangerous secret, or a traitor who endangered his country? Was Cheryl a patriot doing her duty, or an accomplice to kidnapping and torture? The answers depended on values, perspectives, and the weight given to state security versus individual conscience. What remained undeniable was the human cost. A young technician who believed the world deserved transparency paid with decades of his freedom. An intelligence operative who believed her country's survival justified deception paid with the knowledge that intimacy, in her hands, had been a weapon. Both were shaped, and in different ways broken, by decisions made in service of principles larger than themselves. The story of how Mossad seduced and kidnapped Mordechai Vanunu stands as one of the most dramatic operations in modern intelligence history. It combines psychological manipulation, meticulous planning, and flawless execution. It succeeded brilliantly in its immediate goal, removing a security threat from foreign soil and bringing him to trial. But it also raised questions that no operational success could answer. Questions about the boundaries of state power, the treatment of dissenters, and the price paid by individuals caught between conscience and loyalty. Decades later, those questions remain unresolved. Mordechai lives quietly in Europe, a survivor of an ordeal few could endure. Cheryl, if still alive, carries memories of a mission completed and a life manipulated for reasons of state. Between them lies a story that continues to challenge assumptions about secrecy, truth, and justice. A story with no clear villains and no clear heroes, only choices and their consequences.